Katie, welcome back to the Coach's Journey podcast.
Thank you, Robbie.
First guest and then first repeat guest.
I'm very honoured.
Yeah. So for people who are listening in, our idea for this episode is it'll be a slightly different one to what has been the most common format in the podcast so far, which is, and it comes about because you were talking to me a couple of weeks ago about the fact that you'd found yourself being asked a lot by coaches. I think this is right. Correct me if I'm wrong, about the current situation that we're in. And we should say we're recording it on the 30th of March.
Yeah.
So right in the middle of, so we're about in the UK, we're about 10 days into the kind of lockdown period, I think, around coronavirus. And you found that you were getting asked quite a bit by coaches about the situation, really, and you know, you do quite a bit of work with coaches, providing supervision and mentoring and those kind of things. Mm-hmm. And so you'd found yourself pulling together a few ideas of things to think about, things to do during these times for coaches. And I thought, that sounds interesting. Let's have a conversation about that, because the coaches that you're speaking to won't be the only ones who are wondering right now, what's different about this time? And it feels like a nice opportunity for us to just, you know, we'll see where we get to in this conversation, but unpack those ideas that you'd had, see how things have moved even since then. And see where we get to, with that idea being, you know, I guess one of the questions that's present for me is, what does it mean to be a coach in this current moment? You know, and what does the moment mean for coaching and coaches?
Absolutely.
And that's everything from practically what are people doing differently to what does coaching have to offer the world right now, I guess. And I think that I think you shared with me an earlier draft of the ideas you're putting together. But, you know, what I like about that earlier draft is it's got both the really pragmatic and practical and the sense of, there is something about this that's pretty big. And
absolutely.
What does that mean for us all?
Yeah.
And should we also say, I'm going to say it now anyway, you feel like you're probably just getting over having had coronavirus. That's right, isn't it?
Sounds so dramatic when you say it, but I wrote the draft and the document, and had been working with people as it started to unfold, and people started to say, oh, what does this mean for me? And put this together, and then came down with what I'm fairly certain was the coronavirus, so I haven't had a test. But and today is my first day back coaching, first day of having had a proper shower, forgive my appearance, and and feel hugely relieved to be on the mend. My husband's still a bit poorly, but he's a couple of days behind me, I think, and on the mend. So it feels really good to be talking about it, but I do feel as though I've had kind of 10 days out of this strange new world that everyone finds himself in.
And you know, I was thinking I might call this episode "Coaching During Coronavirus," but it didn't quite. When I first thought that, I didn't know that you're able to now literally talk about that, which is kind of,
I think so.
And we're able to smile about it a little bit because it sounds like you're on the mend and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the reasons I was curious to speak to you about this, especially, and maybe that's where we'll just start, is because of the way your practice works. You know, you get a fairly early, reasonably sized sample response.
Yeah, I did.
Whereas, you know, I think that when the measures were, you know, I operate with a smaller practice than you anyway, and it happened that because a project of mine, our contract came to an end, I was operating, I think I had 6 or 7 clients at the moment when the lockdown stuff went up in the UK, which is certainly when I felt it feel different. But you had already, because you work with more people, kind of felt and seen what the response would be. So maybe that's a good place to start. Just what have you noticed in your practice on a high level so far?
Well, I had particularly busy and heavy weeks in the weeks running up to it, because people were wanting to understand what it meant for them, how they felt about it, manage their anxiety. I had business leaders wanting to think about what the impact would be on the business and on the people, and needing space to think through strategy and wanting to hear from me about what other companies were doing. So unusually for me, I felt a bit like a bee that was, in fact, that's what somebody described me as, a bee that was taking pollen from flowers and dropping it around, saying, well, this company's doing this and this company's doing this. And it's quite nice, the cross pollination. But yeah, I was particularly busy. I think 40 clients in 1 week, I seem to remember, and a lot the week before. So yeah, and I was fascinated by, and still am fascinated by, the range in people's responses to the virus and what was happening in the world as it built up. Such a different range in that, but then the commonality of the themes that were people feeling out of control and people feeling uncertain and absorbing that, whether they were actually talking about that with regards to the virus or around something in their relationship or their career or their health, or but themes of uncertainty and lack of control kept popping up.
Yeah, and one of the things you wrote in the document, and we'll put a link to the document in the show notes for people who are listening, but yeah, is that suddenly people feel like, I need to get a plan in place, or that is one of the things you said, and that struck me quite a lot. There's something about how normally in our life, a lot of the things that had been were certain, in any way, or stable, ordered in any part of life, suddenly were getting uncertain and chaotic across our lives, really. And so that's right, isn't it? You noticed a pattern of kind of, I need to get some plans in place, I need to know what I'm going to do, I need to, those kind of things.
That was often when you ask that question as a coach, on what would a useful outcome look like for you today, what would be great to get to by the end of the session, clients were saying, and that with various topics, but they were saying, I'd really love a plan of action, or I'd really love some certainty around what I'm going to do next, or I'd really like a strategy. And I kept noticing that those are common outcomes of coaching sessions, but this became the predominant outcome, that people were wanting some sense of agency and something that they could get some control over it. And even if they weren't realizing that they maybe needed that at the beginning of the session, that's where they were getting to by the end.
And this is a kind of strange question, maybe. How did you feel that was serving people?
Well, I do think that when I've noticed, not just in this period, but over the time of coaching, when people feel out of control, they tend to feel better when they have a sense of what's within their control, what's outside of it, when they get understanding of that. And then when the stuff that they can control, when they start to get to grips with, right, what do I want to do about it, it tends to make people feel better. So I felt during those weeks, particularly coaching at this time, felt like I was providing an enormous service, allowing the space and being with people as they got to that place of, this is what I'm going to do about. And as I say, it wasn't necessarily about anything to do with the coronavirus and the situation. It could have been something that was there anyway for them. But they felt it gave a sense of them feeling even more relieved at the end of a session, or even more buoyant or something. Yeah.
Because they got something, they got the handle on what they could hold, I guess. And it sounds like, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. As a coach, I tell you what, let me say one of the places that question came from. There's a great book, I had it out a minute ago, actually, yes, here it is, called, which I read last year, one of my favorite books, is called Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps, by a woman called Jennifer Garvey Berger, and the subtitle is How to Thrive in Complexity. And one of the things she talks about in that book is, our minds basically evolved for simpler times. And so the complexity of the modern world short circuits that quite a lot. Or, well, she uses the phrase, we fall into these traps where our mind evolved for simpler times, doesn't quite react in the way that is best for us in complex times.
Yeah.
And one of the traps she talks about is the trap of control. Because we used to be able to control most of what was going on.
Yeah.
I guess if we were on the plains or in the jungle or whatever, there was a sense of what we could get control of. And even probably to 100 years ago, much more that was true. And it's just much harder in the modern world, and much, much harder during a time like this when, you know, we're being told to stay inside. You know, we can't even control really where we are in the world. And one of the things that I remember most about reading that book, which is kind of why I had it out today, was when things are out of control, one of the things that seems to happen to us is we substitute things we can. So the thing we want to control is impossible to control because it's too complex. So we substitute in simpler things that we can control.
Yeah.
And sometimes that works well, and sometimes they don't help us with the thing that we want at all. And the kind of the bigger, let's try and do a complexity theory example, would be waiting times in a health system. Like, it sounds, if you want to improve health outcomes in a health system, you might think, what we want to do is we want to get people through the triage fast. So you put a waiting time on an A&E. And that sounds good, except then everyone obsesses with controlling this substitute thing, which isn't actually what everyone wants to be better, because everyone wants their health outcomes to be better, and we end up getting trapped controlling this simple thing that we definitely can control, but it doesn't give us what we want. The reason I think I'm saying that is it sounds like then for coaches, one of the important things is to help clients really identify the things they can control that matter to them.
That matter. Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
Yeah.
To make sure that we're helping people, you know, both not get overwhelmed by the massive uncertainty and the sense of everything being out of control, but also make sure that they're contributing to whatever it is, you know, the truth, the listening for that truth of what they're facing, I guess. Yeah,
it's a good point, Robbie, that to look at something, if you're going to build a plan and have a strategy, make sure it is something that does matter to you and is going to make a difference. Yeah.
But also, as I'm saying that, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if the person just wants to feel better in the moment and feel like things are within their control, if that's the number one driver and thing that will make the most difference, then to some extent, it doesn't matter what the plan is contributing to, I guess.
Yeah, and that comes back to the sense of calm for me, that calming has been an enormous part of the work that I was doing before I was poorly. In those sessions, a real sense of whether it was through having a plan or a strategy, or whether it was just through talking and offloading, but calm felt like a place that people really wanted to get to in their various ways, and a plan can be a way to calm.
Yeah, and then that brings up a couple of things which I think are interesting for us to think about this time. I don't know which one's more interesting for you to go to first. I think we might want to hit both. One is there's something really interesting about what happens at the start of coaching sessions.
Yeah, so I was very interested in that.
And the other is how we as coaches manage the fact that we are also full of uncertainty right now, especially because many coaches are fully or at least partially self-employed. There's perhaps extra uncertainty, but we're all just facing this very strange time.
Yeah.
What's more interesting to start with, do you think? The start of conversations?
I think you have to start with the fact that this is the first time that we as coaches have had exactly the same scenario in some ways as every one of our clients is, because that ties into then at the beginning of our sessions, I think. And I just, so what happened was, as you said, Robbie, a lovely client of mine, a coach who's fantastic, she started her session a couple of weeks back by saying, Katie, I want you to download to me this coaching in the time of Corona, and I want you to tell me everything you've noticed. And I hadn't thought about it, I hadn't amassed my thinking on it, but it turned out I had stuff to offer. But the thing that I said first that really blew her away, because she hadn't quite kind of thought it properly, was the fact that we as coaches tend to be working with our clients on a range of different topics with a range of different situations. And sometimes there might be, like when I was going through IVF for my children, someone might have been going through IVF at the same time. So occasionally there was one where you'd really be very mindful, me and them going through a similar thing. But then you'd move on to your next client and it would be a different topic. And sometimes maybe you've got a niche, which is an area that you understand, but typically you're not really in that or in the challenges anymore, probably. And so, yeah, this is the first time I think that coaches are working with the same stuff going out there in the field, as it's called, as we have going out there in the field for us. I was thinking maybe there's an exception to that with an internal coach whose maybe company is struggling and making redundancies, and so maybe that is too. But largely, yeah, this is really uncharted territory for us as coaches, and it plays out in huge ways, I think, with us working effectively and with really good presence with our clients. We have to be so mindful. And the coach that I was speaking to just hadn't quite clocked it, that a lot that was going on for her was that she hadn't quite realized I'm going through what they're going through, with our different dynamics within that, of course. But yeah, that's something that we have to be mindful of right from the beginning, I think.
And what do you think are the main implications of that for coaches?
So I think there's a few. And I'm thinking which to speak to first, because part of it is about, I'll go to the beginning bit of the session, if that's all right, because it does set the tone and it's important. So what I was noticing was, normally, as we know, we start a session, and if it's a regular client that we work with, we might say, hello, how are you? How's the week been? We catch up. There's what I think of as chat. And I really like that chat, and it's vital for the relationship, and often does lead into the topic for the session. Not always, sometimes does, but it's a human thing that needs to happen at the beginning of the session, and then we typically will go into, how would you like to use your space today? That might run from the chat, but might not. Well, that was absolutely changing before my very eyes, because people would say, Katie, can you believe what's just happened in the last week? And I know, I can't believe what's happened. Since we last spoke, this has happened and this has happened. And how are you? And how's Lee? And how are your kids? And are your kids off school yet? And are the schools closed? What do you think? Do you think the schools could close? What do you think about Boris Johnson? What's he saying? And it would just go on. And I would be thinking in my head as I was going along, I need to stop talking now, because I'm being drawn into talking about my feelings about what's happening, and my husband and children, and then I'm asking about your husband and children, and before I know it, we're 15 minutes into the session, and we're talking even without an emotional element to it. We're talking about this, and it's going on. And I realized I've really got to think through a strategy for myself, really, as to how I handle the fact that this could happen at the beginning of every single session, and maybe that's absolutely okay. I just need to think about how I handle that so that it's most useful for the client, and make sure that I still remain in coaching presence, because that for me is the key. Because by chatting about the virus, the situation, the children, the schools, how am I going to homeschool, I'm being taken out of coaching presence and into a world that's very real and emotive for me at the moment.
Yeah, and
have you noticed that, Robbie?
Yeah, it's, the first time I started realizing that it was a thing. So I have a practice really that I try and answer honestly from presence when people say, how are you? Including my clients, right? I try and model, that integrity and honesty value is really important to me. And I think it's one of the things that we can gift our clients, right? I'm trying to create a relationship of deep honesty. Yeah. So if someone says, how are you? It then gets, it's very tricky not to speak to the current situation in some way.
Absolutely.
And if I'm just checking in, sometimes I try and answer from literally, what do I notice if I check in with my body and my thoughts in the moment? And even that, particularly for me, the kind of biggest wobble I had was the 48 hours or so after the first time that the UK raised the kind of measures pre-lockdown, but the first time they started to really step change the way it was. And in that 48 hours, like if I checked in with myself, I was anxious and edgy.
Yeah.
And that's then a very tricky decision to be made about what gets shared at that point and how, and all those things. And let alone what you were speaking to, which I think is really true. And I heard two things in there. One is the sense of it just going on longer.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's because it needs to happen or not. And the other is, you start accidentally getting into the headspace of all that stuff, which when it gets personal as well. So when you're talking about, if I'm talking about the particular relatives of mine who I am most worried about, because that's where you get to, then that knocks me out of presence particularly. So
absolutely.
it is a really interesting one. Just to a bit like you say, slow down and think, well, what is the right thing for me to do here? Me specifically as a coach with my specific clients and
my specific triggers too. Right. There's a good point that you make there around, because what I noticed was everyone that I'm working with had particular triggers or anxieties or worries about the situation. And of course, I'm no different. And of course, the coaches I'm with are no different. I noticed the full range of those, but it became so important to me to work out, okay, what are my particular ones, so that if the client touches those at the beginning through the chat or later through the session, that I'm not taken straight out of my presence. And my particular one was diabetes, because I'm diabetic. So whenever the news would say, and for the high risk people who have diabetes, every time I'd get a jolt. And so I had a client say to me, I mean, thank God I'm not in one of the high risk groups. Like, I'm not old, I don't have diabetes, and they didn't know that I do. And so I just had a jolt straight out of presence, thinking, I've got diabetes. I don't know what this means for me. And my husband's trigger has always been and was always about freedom. It's his top value. He cannot bear to be kept in. And so if he were a coach, he'd really be having to watch the trigger around people's clients saying, we're going to be completely locked in for 12, 18 months. And he would be knocked out of presence, I'm sure, if he were coaching around that. It just becomes really important as a coach to figure out, what are my bruises, anxieties, real key triggers around this.
Yeah, and it's almost, I mean, there's a few ways we might touch on this in different ways, and in this conversation or at a time like this. But for me, it's almost like there's that old Zen saying, which gets credited to the Dalai Lama a lot. I think it's just an old one, which is, I meditate for an hour a day, except when I'm busy. Then I meditate for 2 hours a day, and the situation for me seems to speak to that, like in all ways at all times. So it's like, as a coach, I think it's always really important that we understand our own triggers. It's why it's important that we have coaching for ourselves. It's why it's important that we undertake supervision and all those kind of things, so that we know in a moment, as well as we can. It's just like in psychotherapy, so that we know in a moment, is this me right now, or is it the client, or is it something that's happening in this conversation? And it's doubly important now, because there are a load of new extra ones getting thrown at us in uncertainty, like, potentially in every conversation in different ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so where have you, I guess you're coming back out of this, time of coaching less, but where did you come to in the end with, what's your intuition about how to hold that start of the conversation?
Yeah, good point. So this is where I came to for me personally, but I would just encourage and invite all coaches to think about what they think it means for them. But I first of all realized that I must never do this thing that I did do, embarrassingly, more than once. But prior to the session, on one occasion, a client called 5 minutes late, and I was ready, prepared. And in those 5 minutes, because my mind was whirring and it's busy out there in the world, I picked up my phone and scrolled to the news and read something really horrible. And my heart rate was going. I was really anxious in the phone calls, and I had to say, hello, James, how are you today? Not at all in coaching presence. So the first thing to say is, part of my strategy is now to, and it goes without saying, it should have done, but it didn't for me, definitely don't read any news prior to a coaching session. And just make sure to, even more, as you say, the doubling up, but double up on working at your presence prior to picking up the phone or having that face-to-face session. So that was my number one obvious lesson to myself.
It's so funny, that one, isn't it? I'm sorry. The reason I'm laughing away to myself when you're saying that is because, I have a load of rules about things like that. Now, it wasn't a coronavirus specific one. It wasn't even a coaching one. But last night at about 10 to 10, I just checked my email. Do you know what I mean? Like, I have a rule, like, to never check especially my work email after, within an hour and a half of going to bed, just because it's just not worth it. And I don't even know why I did it really, but I just got an email which just completely knocked me off center. And, it's just like, in a way, it doesn't matter how many times you tell yourself to do the sensible. It doesn't matter how many times, I can speak for myself only, I tell myself to do these sensible habits, but it's,
you got to double up on it at this time.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that it is worth everyone sitting down, coaches especially, if you want to keep doing really good work at times like this, and thinking, it's what are your triggers, and also what are the things, the bad habits that you really need to not let slip in at times like this.
Exactly that, the bad habits that you need to not let slip in, and the good habits that you need to reinforce even more, maybe double up on. Maybe if you normally give yourself 5 minutes to present and center before a session, maybe it's 10 minutes at the moment, with all that's going on and with how busy our minds are. So for me, that is an obvious one, but it was more than just that once that I did it. That was the most dramatic of them. But then after that, so of course, people are going to say, how are you, and want to comment on the time. I think there's been a few that have not mentioned it, but there've been hardly any, and that, I believe, is their style as well, their coping style, to not even comment on the fact that this is going on. But the vast majority of people I'm working with have commented on it, have said what a crazy time, strange time, whole new world, and then have talked about how it's impacting them and have wanted to ask me too. And I believe, like you, I have wonderful relationships with my clients. It would be very weird if I just didn't answer that and talk to them a bit about how it is me. But I decided in my strategy that I want to talk about it neutrally and give some information, but neutral information. And then I discovered what was working really well for me was to end that bit where I talk about me with something that I'm very grateful for around it. Now, it could sound, I'm aware, very twee this and very reframey, but it was working. As I say, I just feel as I'm coming back to it, but it was working really well. So, and it's true, prior to the last week when I was really poorly, I just kept feeling exceptionally grateful to be locked down with my family, that I feel that we get on very well. I feel lucky to have this job that I can work virtually and be of real service at the moment. And yes, so there's things that I'm not so lucky for. For example, we don't have any outside space, which with 3 boys is not easy to not have a garden, but there's so many things that I do have that I'm lucky for, like food in the fridge and stuff. So that was real, and I'd say how we were feeling and how this was happening neutrally. I'd make sure I didn't talk too much emotive stuff about being anxious about diabetes. No, I didn't go into any of that, but I did just say a few things neutrally and then come to a thing I'm grateful for. And then after that, I talked to them. And I noticed that by doing that, it kind of would invite the space for them to talk about them, but it would also get them into a kind of positive frame, because people would then start talking about what they were feeling grateful for around it, etc. Then after they'd kind of said how they were, I have been pretty quickly coming to, how would you like to use your space today? So definitely not barging in with that after 30 seconds, but remembering and really being strict with myself to come to that question again, more so than I normally have to remind myself. And it could be, and I'd certainly say it could be, that they want to talk about the situation and to continue sharing how it's making them feel or the impact of it, etc. And it could be that there's something different that they want to use the session for. So really remembering that question number 1 as I think of it, what's the topic?
Yeah. And also, I don't know if you've been doing this, but I've been occasionally naming it. It's like, oh, we could, it's very easy at a time like this to just spend the whole conversation talking about what's going on. If you want to do that, that's perfect, but you might also want to move into something else.
Nice.
Therefore, question 1, if you like, here's how do you want to use the time today? And I think
it's great to name it.
They're also just kind of good. These are all good practices anyway, aren't they? Like, I think that I noticed that in my coaching occasionally anyway. It's like, oh, wait a sec, we're a little too far into this conversation without having, we're still in it, we're kind of just chatting. And that's perfect because we're people and we know each other, but actually now's the time to, and then remind myself and often take a deep breath and ask a pointedly coaching question to move us into it.
Exactly. And again, as you say, it is just reminding ourselves to double up on a good coaching habit that we should already have, but because of this time, we could be knocked off.
Because there is something about this as well, which I think you've talked to really nicely, which is that, especially for those, when we're working with someone who we've worked with for a long time, it would be strange to not mention it, to not bring that in at all, to not reference it, and and sometimes, I don't think I've actually specifically done this, not a time isn't coming to mind, but it's like one of the things I try and say to clients regularly anyway, look, is even if we've got a plan for what we might be going to use a session for, there's always space to bring something else in. That hasn't really come up for me, I don't think, in the last month or so, but it does feel important that people know, even if you're working, because I wouldn't work in this way. I know you mostly don't work in this way. Even I think for coaches who have got a very clear 6-step session plan with clients, at times like this, giving some space to deviate from that feels important to me. But it's this place that we're talking about. It's a very fine line and probably an intuitive judgment in the conversation. You definitely don't want to be guiding people to that, because they may really want to not talk about coronavirus in their way.
That's right. So again, has to be their choice, just as we'd always do. I think the thing is to make sure that it is a choice, not just a falling into, just to make sure they remember, as always, this space is their choice.
Yeah. And is there anything else about the kind of mechanics of the coaching conversations that you've noticed you've had to, or chosen to, shift?
Let me just sit with that a minute, Robbie. Not sure it's to do with the mechanics. Well, I mean, actually, to do with the mechanics, I've had to be a lot more flexible with timings with clients. That is quite mechanical. But yeah, people have been all over the place with cancelling here, cancelling there, rescheduling. And that's not just been me this last week, because I've had to cancel a lot. But that is prior to that as well. And I've had to, people have done it in different ways. Some people have done it quite without any kind of notice, or without any kind of sorry, or without anything, which is unusual, and other people with an awful lot of apology and very respectful. But it's been interesting just to note people's different behaviours around this, and yeah, my timetable has been quite thrown up around and chucked around and everything, and I've had to really sometimes had to dig into some patience and compassion around that, and remember that everyone is grappling with the same stuff again that I'm grappling with, but people don't always think from other people's point of views about how that's going to land, and they're in a world of fear or disruption or something. So yeah, that mechanically, talking of that has been something that I've noticed.
So I love the way you talk about lean into the compassion and that kind of thing. What decisions have you made practically about cancellation charges, how you rearrange? Have you given people extra leeway, or has it been a case by case? How have you felt about all that stuff?
I've given people leeway. Yeah, is the thing. Now I'm a bit of a softie about that anyway, but a softie with boundaries, I would like to say. But I have been absolutely giving leeway, and I'm glad I was as well, because then I've had to then ask for the leeway back by cancelling last week or rescheduling. But yeah, I've given leeway absolutely everywhere. The one thing I did notice was there was somebody who I'd rearranged everything with home working and my husband and all around making sure that I could coach this one session, and they just pulled it at the last minute, and I noticed that I sent what for me was a more passive aggressive message than I would, because I rarely do that, but I did, and I owned it afterwards. I sent the message, and then and really it was probably quite minimal, but for me it wasn't coming from the place I'd like to, and then I did send an apology afterwards and said, look, I just had been juggling stuff, but it's totally fine, we're all in this, and as I say, then had my comeuppance when I was poorly next week and I had to cancel, but yeah, I have been, I know it'll settle down, and I have a practice where people are really respectful about 24-hour cancellation policies, and people just rarely mess me around, so I know it will come back, but it was a crazy few weeks for that.
And there's also, I just want to pull it out because it's a really nice thing that you said there, that you caught that message and were like, this is out of this is out of my normal way of practicing this, and probably comes from your own, it's like like you said before, being aware of our own triggers. And honoring that with someone, that's powerful, leading by example. I think that. And you, I guess, sorry, I asked a weird question about mechanics, didn't I? I guess you work on the phone, and so actually that's a really nice thing. It's probably worth saying, one of the things I've been thinking about quite a bit, which I don't think I've ever written about or shared anywhere, but I remember once saying to some coaches who are colleagues of mine at a company which does all work online, and me just giving them some advice on how to deal with working with people online, because they hadn't really done it before they worked for this company. And I just think it's worth saying for people who are having to move online, my main learning from the first few months of when I first did that years ago was, like, give the technology, one strike basically, and then kind of have a set of fallback options. So for me, what that is I'm often working on Zoom, like we're having this conversation now. If that isn't working, it's usually not my internet. And actually, it's worth saying, for that, people who are working from home for the first time on Zoom, it's worth plugging into your router if you can. It's worth having headphones so that you're not echoing. It's worth being next to the router if you can't. But if the video still isn't working, turn off the video. And give clients who aren't used to this full permission to break in. To say, if it's getting distracting, let me know. Don't suffer in silence. Basically, you don't want to find out at the end of a coaching call that your internet has been cutting out the whole time.
That's right.
Disrupting their thing. And if it doesn't work, switch off the video. If it's still not working, call people on the phone, and have all that stuff ready to go. Basically, just because, the worst thing it would be to have the whole conversation disrupted by technological things.
You're so right and wise to pull those mechanics of that out, Robbie, because I don't think people think that through to start with, and they can spend weeks and months with frustrations. And that's the problem, is that it can be very frustrating, the technology. So you keep trying to get back into the Zoom room, or you keep trying and then sending another thing and then trying again, and both people are apologizing, or one's getting cross, and all of a sudden your coaching presence is absolutely being eroded, and you're not in the space that you want to be. So you're right to contract with your client well around it. So we try this. If it doesn't work, we take the visual off. We go to audio on Zoom, and if that doesn't work, then we go to WhatsApp, or we go to FaceTime, or we go to whatever it is, an audio line on the telephone. But to have contracted that in advance so that you go seamlessly, right, it's not working, audio, and that works really well for me too.
Absolutely. And look, I would say the other thing to say about tech problems is something I learned from my old coach Rich. He would always say, use that stuff, whatever happens in the world during the session, treat it as a sign from the universe. So if the technology has meant the conversation got massively disrupted for 10 minutes, when you come back in, don't try and go back to where you were before the 10-minute disruption. Just come back to the moment. See what is happening now. Sometimes I even ask it, it's like, well, if that was a sign from the universe, what was it a sign about? Or sometimes I just use it as an opportunity to recontract. It's like, okay,
absolutely,
we've had that, we're here now what?
Exactly. And that's really, really works well. Sometimes I'm really grateful for them, for those wobbles on the internet, or the reception breaking up because I'm off on audio, because we will have been into something, the client will have been talking a lot maybe, and then we have that break, they have to recall back in, and I can use that to say, okay, where are we now? Or all that piece of great work that you just did then, where's that bringing you? And I'm sometimes really grateful. Sometimes it gives me a breather just to go, okay, sit with that. And then to remember, okay, this is where they wanted there to go as an outcome. How are we doing? I must question that. And so rather than getting het up by the technology or frustrated by it, which takes away our coaching presence, remember to use it. Well done, Rich.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I guess there's two things that we've mentioned that we haven't come back to that I definitely want to tick off, get to before we run out of time. I think my intuition next is, and I'll tell you why that came into my mind just then, in a sec, is the uncertainty that coaches as self-employed people may be feeling right now, and if there's anything there. And the reason that comes to mind is I've been thinking about Rich a lot in the last few weeks, because I'm incredibly grateful that he told me a story about how when his dad died, he wasn't able to create any, he basically just didn't create any new business for months. And that was when he realized the importance of building financial stability, because when our work depends so much on us, if we can't do it for whatever reason, I mean, this is an obvious thing to say, right? But sometimes we have to live it ourselves, or have someone like Rich tell that story in such a affecting way. You have to build in some contingency for that. And so I've been feeling very grateful, because at some point in the month or two after that, I started rearranging my finances to have some money for in case disaster strikes. And I was imagining that it would be a health problem for me, it would be a health problem for my family, whatever that is. It turns out it has left me feeling, much more secure in my work now than I would have been otherwise, because 2 years after putting away, what mine is I put 5% of all the money that comes in into a rainy day account, which for Game of Thrones fans is called Winter is Coming. But it's good to give, that's another thing I learned from Rich, good to give your bank accounts funny names. My tax account is called I Love Paying Tax as well.
Excellent.
That's stolen straight from Litvin. But there's something about, so I imagine lots of people in this moment are worrying about their money. And in the UK, the government has made an amazingly generous offer to self-employed people. It won't get the cash soon, but I was kind of blown away by that, what they're offering there, which hopefully will relieve the pressure on some people. But actually, the reason I wanted to say something about this now is I just think you may think that now is not the time. Like, this time will show us the instability and in our society probably, but particularly in our lives. And actually, if what you're seeing right now, if what someone is seeing right now is, I can't believe I haven't done that work to get my finances in order, like, now's the time to actually do it.
Yeah.
And the same is probably true in other ways around this. But I guess, what is it, what is your reflections on, for coaches who are facing that uncertainty around self-employedness, around our work and our business? Where do we go in these moments?
Well, one thing I think we don't do is make assumptions about it. So I'm hearing various different assumptions, and some people will be saying, well, it's the end of coaching for a while, isn't it? Because, businesses aren't going to be using coaches and people aren't going to have the money to pay for them. And then I have other coaches going, well, hey, we get to really be of service and I'm busier than I've ever been. Oh my goodness, this is such a good time for me. So not to make assumptions around it for the industry and for coaching, I think is really important.
Yeah, and let me just catch, actually, I was on a call, I do work for a company called Better Up, and I was on a call with their CEO, a kind of all hands for coaches last week, or the week before. And I can't remember exactly what is public when, so I can't give too many of the details, but I can definitely say that he said in the conversation, and they have conversations with big companies about coaching offers, and they said they sell big contracts into famous companies like Mars and LinkedIn, and he was very positive. He felt like the overall signal he'd got, a bit like you said at the start of, you mentioned you'd had some, or maybe in the document you mentioned you'd had some people stopping, some people starting, some people doing more coaching than they would have otherwise. That his response seemed to be, from what I'm hearing and feeling, it's a positive moment for them and they're amongst their customers and clients. So that's just to say that for people, because I think that is probably worth noting.
I think it's worth noting because although there is a range of assumptions people are making, I notice the most common assumption is a negative one. So I like that you're putting in the opposite to that. And as you say in the document that I wrote, it's borne out to be true a couple of weeks later since writing, actually, is that some of my clients have had to pause or stop, unfortunately, because of their business being in the tourism industry or something. But then I've had quite now even more new clients come on board saying, I've got this period at home, it's a perfect time to think through what I want to do with my life, with my career, with my this, with that. Or it's a perfect time to set up this online business and I want some support. So I've had a number of new clients, and then had some, as I said, needing to double up as they think through leading their business particularly. So I've also had that full range, full mix. And I know of some coaches that have been really, really flooded with work during this time, supporting people through the changes they go through. So yeah, don't make assumptions about it, and have a think about where the opportunities to support people and businesses could be for you, and yeah, note the assumptions that you might be making either way about it.
Yeah, it's great. And it does lead into that kind of perhaps the last thing we might want to talk about, which is that question about the opportunities. I've been I have my 12-minute writing practice, and of course, so I write, for those who don't know, I write a weekly article in the 12 minutes with a timer and then share it. And the interesting thing about having that kind of practice is you end up writing about whatever's happening. So of course, the last 3 that I've written have been about this in different ways. And, there is there are kind of 2 thoughts that come to my mind. One is, there will be at times like this, just like in a recession economically, there will be for businesses, there will be some businesses that go under, and there will be some that emerge stronger. And I think one of the things for coaches to think about is, do you want to be one of the ones who emerge stronger? And if so, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And the other one, which is interesting, that came from another coach that you and I both know, I'm sure, a future guest, Mike Toller. He brought to question, he was quickly to distance himself. It wasn't his question, it came from someone else. But as far as I'm concerned, Mike told me a great question, which was something like, how do you want to remember this period?
Yeah, nice.
And I think it's for so many people, it's interesting, just like those prospective clients reaching out to people. It's like, I've suddenly got more freedom now.
Yeah.
In how I use my day. Not everyone, of course. And I don't want to lessen the impact that this will be having on many people who will be feeling very difficult times, like you mentioned. People, we know who work in tourism or an industry like that that's been massively affected. People whose families, or people they know very closely, may have already got very ill. But there is a sense of possibility and an opportunity in a time like this as well. And at the very least, it feels useful for us at the times we can do that to take ourselves to that place of what is the opportunity here.
Yeah, that is, at least, as you say, not to trivialize the difficulties that many people will be facing, but then, yes, to ask ourselves, well, what's the opportunity for me here? And for coaches to ask, what is the opportunity within this? Is it to learn to work virtually when maybe that had always seemed a bit scary? Is it to be brave and offer out coaching to people where you felt anxious about doing that before maybe, but now you can see that it could really serve some people during this time? Is it to offer to work charitably and volunteer your time somewhere and see what that brings? Is it time to write a book or to create a program? Or there's so many potential opportunities at this time could give us as coaches, I think.
Yeah, I was just thinking, you say write a book. I was just thinking, it's all the habits that people wish they had during other times. It's like, there's somehow, for many people, not just coaches, that little bit more opportunity to be flexible about, okay, well, maybe I will. I was feeling very grateful this morning. I do a weekly gratitude, 5 things to be grateful for with, I can't remember if I said this on this podcast before, but I've always thought I should have a gratitude practice. And then I found out my wife had one kind of semi-secretly that she'd never told me about.
Amazing.
It just came up and then we just joined it. I can just join in. And then so her weekly gratitude thing reminds me to do mine. Anyway, one of the things I was very grateful for is that I've had a habit now for about 1.5 years of just reading for 15 minutes when I have my morning coffee every morning. And I've always felt, sometimes I feel guilty telling people about that habit because not everyone is in the luxurious position of having the freedom to create that 15 minutes. But actually now, let's make a conservative guess that 50% more people do have the flexibility to create a small habit like that.
Yeah. And there's an opportunity.
There's an opportunity. There's a website, I'll put a link to it, called, I think it's aim-u, who are currently providing free coaching and well-being services to NHS professionals. That's an opportunity to do something really wonderful. Yeah, I completely agree with you. You know, there's an opportunity. One of the things I like doing with clients that I have who are coaches is helping them see the story that makes it, you know, a generous and honorable thing to do, to reach out to people, to invite them to do some coaching. And actually right now, anyone listening could sit down and think, well, look, what can I create in the next month? You know, and if it's 5 90-minute spaces for 90-minute slots, then sit down and think of the 5 people you've ever worked with who are most likely to be affected by the uncertainty and the complexity, and reach out to them and say, look, I've just been thinking about you, or this weird guy on the podcast made this suggestion. I thought it was a great idea. You should do this. And I thought of you, and I just wanted to say, if you want, there's 90 minutes for you. And it's just a beautiful gift that you can give.
It really is. And a lot of coaches that I supervise and mentor feel, well, a big topic that they bring is that they hate sales. They hate the feeling of selling themselves and selling them services, and they don't want to feel like a used car salesman. And like you say, we work hard to get to a place of being of service and offering coaching, knowing that it will bring brilliant things to people if they use it. And this has never been a better time to really get into that space of thinking, I can offer something here. I can really be of service for people to think through things, strategize, as we said, for people to even to just come to calm in all of this space. And yeah, there's never been a better example, I think, of how useful we can be in the world, because it is the world, not just our locality, but in the world, how useful we can be in it. If there was ever a time to help us feel that what we're offering is not snake oil, or it's not anything, it's not a widget that we're trying to sell, but it's something that's really, really needed by humans right now. Hopefully that can help coaches overcome any natural shyness or any anxieties or worries or insecurities, and get out there and support people in some way.
Yeah, and I'm gonna, I think this is a really nice place to start to bring the conversation to a close. But I'm going to share something, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I completely agree. It's almost like, or it feels even more so in this moment than I think I had thought about it earlier. But me and a couple of friends of mine, including Mike, who I mentioned before, have put out a little offer at the moment. We've made 3 spaces a week. And when writing the copy for that was the easiest thing I'd ever done, probably for something like this, because it's just like, people are losing their jobs. People are trapped in uncertainty. People are working in professions which are under more pressure than ever. And some people are sitting thinking, what's the opportunity for me here? How can I be of service? How can I create something? And those are all 4 of those examples and more are perfect times for coaching. And there is a possibility that that one of the impacts of this period will be far more people will experiment with and then grow to understand what coaching is and when it's useful. And we don't know that yet, and we'll see it in the future. But I do feel like coaching is an industry born, when it's done right, is a practice born for helping people in uncertain and complex times.
So
and there's certainly never been a global uncertain and complex time like this. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens over the weeks and months ahead. I don't know if you've got any.
Just that we talk about finding the opportunity, and for me, the opportunity for coaching as a profession here is absolutely huge, and it's for every one of us coaches when we're feeling well, to take that opportunity to help our profession grow in whatever way lights your fire individually. But the opportunity here for coaching as a profession in the world, being of service and support, is huge right now.
Yeah, and that's a great way to think about it. What lights your fire specifically? Right now,
we each have to do that for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Katie, feels like a whistle stop conversation. Is there anything else you wanted to catch? Is there anything else you want to catch before we
Yes, a million, but we don't have the time. I wanted to talk about the change curve, the Kubler-Ross change curve, and do think about that, coaches, if you like where people are on that change curve and where you are on it, because there's no doubt that people are in different places. But a million more things I could talk for hours more about, the fascinating time that we coaches are in. But no, everybody just keep really well and look for the opportunity here for yourself and coaching.
Yeah, brilliant. Katie, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thanks so much, Robbie, for providing the space for this. I think it's an important conversation. And yeah, I'll put out to you, Robbie, a document, and it will also have a link to that NHS volunteer work too, which is really important.
Yeah, and as usual, for anyone listening, I'll put links to other things on at thecoachesjourney.com. And yeah, but Katie, thanks so much. And until until your third appearance on the podcast, whenever that will be, thank you.
The next global pandemic. Speak soon, Robbie. Take care, everybody. Be well.